taxpayers for audit in an equitable manner. Can you explain the concern with respect to the equity of audits and particularly any drops in audit rates for incomes making over $500,000 a year?
I'll ask Mr. McTighe to respond.
Again, thank you, Congresswoman. In the report that you referenced, we did point out that audit rates have declined by about a third since 2010 across the board, but they have declined more dramatically for higher income individuals. And the reason behind that has really been a resource and a capacity issue. Auditing high income, high wealth individuals, partnerships, corporations require a lot of expertise, both human capital as well as information technology and analytics, whereas auditing lower income individuals is much more straightforward. The IRS has a lot of information from third parties on income such as wages, and less information on other types of income. So there's a wide disparity there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to your note, auditing the rich is an enormously complex process that takes a lot of manpower. And the cuts to IRS enforcement are strategic, and they have resulted in a loss of revenue. Is that correct?
IRS has been unable over the past decade to backfill, very highly skilled individuals.
Thank you. I apologize. I just have to reclaim because I don't have time. But what we see here, and I'd like to submit unanimous consent to submit the report from the GAO, that there was an 87% decline in audits for taxpayers making between $500,000 and $5 million. And according to the GAO, we've seen that the new funding for the IRS that we've recently put in the Inflation Reduction Act has increased those revenues over 10 years. So instead of looking at climate and instead of looking at cuts to health care, we should examine why our colleagues in the Republican Party is so invested in protecting the wealthiest people in this society and would rather attack health care and services for our veterans than repealing tax cuts for yacht owners and private jets. And with that, I yield my time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Grofman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Yes, I'd like to focus a little bit on the Department of Defense, arguably the most important department because our freedom depends upon them doing a good, efficient job. First of all, the Department of Defense financial management and contractor management have been on the GAO's high-risk list since the early 90s. Why is that?
The financial management part, and I'll ask Mr. DiNapoli to talk about contract management, but on the financial management, they've been unable to pass the test of an independent audit. They're the only major federal agencies that have been unable to pass the test of an audit. Their financial systems and controls are not sufficient. There have been hundreds of identified weaknesses by people who are doing the audits now. For many years, the department didn't try to do a financial audit. But in the last 5 years they have, and they're making some good progress in that area. They're finding good benefits from the financial audits. They're finding helicopters they didn't know they had on the books. They're finding lots of supplies. They're saving some money by not reordering things that they already have. So there's some benefits to it, but the main reason is they haven't been able to pass the test of an independent audit, financial audit.
Why compared to other agencies is the Department of Defense so much worse? Is it arrogance? Is it ignorance? What would you attribute it to?
Well, a part of it's scale. For a number of years, it was lack of effort, to be honest with you. I mean, the requirement's been in place since 1996. For about a decade or so, they really just certified they were unauditable and didn't do it. More recently, there's been commitment in the last 2 administrations, and I've been very pleased about it. And they're starting to take it seriously. They recognize they need it in order to manage more efficiently and effectively. But it's a big agencies, and there's not a lot of standardization across the department. So there's a lot of decentralized efforts, and therefore the systems are unable to exchange information properly.
Thanks. In November of 2022, Defense failed its 5th consecutive audit. It was unable to account for 61% of its $3.5 trillion in assets. What are the reasons why the DoD can't produce a clean audit?
A couple of reasons. One, their financial systems are unable to, or are not reliable in a number of cases. Secondly, they don't have good internal controls over their property, over their inventory systems, and that's a problem. They also don't have the full type of skills in their workforce that they need in those areas, and so it's a myriad of issues.
Could you elaborate on they don't have the skills? How is this possible they don't have the skills?
Well, there are not enough people. I mean, if you haven't, this is the issue. For over 200 years, the federal government operated without any financial statements or independent financial audits. We started in the 90s. So this wasn't a big priority in those areas. And then for a number of years, the department didn't think they needed to do this. And so they didn't build the capacity that they need in those areas. Most of the expertise in financial management in the federal government's been in the budget area, not in preparing financial statements and auditing, or to have the systems people necessary to produce those statements. So they're trying and they're making improvements, but I still think they need additional skills to be able to do this.
And we'll jump ahead here. What's the dollar figure for waste the GAO has identified at the Pentagon? And this number will include the GAO alone and not include the Department of Defense Inspector General's numbers.
Yeah. We're working on a figure now for government-wide waste. So far, the only figure we've come up with has been for the unemployment insurance program, which is over $60 billion at the low end of the range.
Okay. Department of Defense last estimated that in 2014, contractors were in possession of $220 billion in government-furnished property, but GAO says that number is significantly understated. Why does GAO believe that?
I'll ask Mr. DiNapoli to respond.
Thank you for the question. It's a lot about the similar issues that Gene mentioned with regard to financial management also occur in the property management system. So having the proper records, having the information technology systems to govern that process, and then having the folks to do the proper oversight of those, all combined to having information about the amount of government property in contractors' hands probably being excessively low.
Okay, I'll give you a little different question. I sometimes feel, they always say generals are fighting the last war. And I look at stuff like aircraft carriers, which when they have war games get sunk right away. Do you guys have any comments on the Department of Defense, or maybe even shouldn't say the Department of Defense, our Appropriations Committee and Armed Services funding weaponry that may not be up to snuff or wouldn't last very long in a 21st century war?
So thank you for that question. And that is another high-risk area in our weapons systems work, which has also been on the high-risk list since 1990. And what we've continually found through the past 30 years is the Department of Defense continually buys weapons systems in a manner that results in cost overruns and schedule delays, and often doesn't provide the warfighters what they need when they need it.
Thank you very much. I think I think our Department of Defense, and quite frankly, some people in this building are a little bit embarrassing as far as protecting our country. But thank you for letting me go a little over.
Chair recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome Mr. Dodaro. It's wonderful to have you here today, and thank you to all the staff who are joining us. Mr. Chairman, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for having this hearing. This is exactly the kind of hearing that this committee should be having, is actual oversight and the fiscal responsibilities of the federal government. And I'm particularly grateful to have all of you here and to have this discussion as a former Senate committee employee and a former examiner at OMB. I'm very familiar with your work, and I've actually worked with a number of you over the years, so it's great to have you here today. I want to start out by saying, as the representative for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, many of the items that are in the high-risk list for this year are items that, of course, New Mexicans experience every single day. Of the programs and items that are listed under high-risk, issues around tribal communities and their access to health care, funding for the Bureau of Indian Education, issues around access to disabilities programs through Medicaid and through through the VA system, and of course, many of the issues around military spending and the other issues that have been discussed this morning. So I want to dive in on some of these issues here, but I do want to take a moment to amplify on some of the comments that were made earlier, in that it's particularly peculiar to be having this hearing this week, as we learned just this morning in the wee hours of the night last night, the GOP in the Rules Committee dropped their version of the debt ceiling negotiation, which is really a ransom note for many of the programs that we're talking about that are covered under this report. In fact, in the name of balancing the debt ceiling, the GOP is proposing to cut for 10 years federal programs across the board. And in the GAO's high-risk report, it's acknowledged over and over again across the hundreds of pages of this report that part of why we've made progress on the high-risk list is because we've been making investments, and particularly congressional investments in these programs. And in particular, I want to highlight those investments in climate change, since one of the proposals in the GOP's proposal this week is to gut the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as other programs. In a 2019 report that the GAO published, it was estimated that by 2040, that climate would cost the United States $315 billion a year. And the GAO said in this report that for every single dollar that we spent on climate change as the federal government, it would save the federal government $11. That's an 11-to-1 investment. So when we hear arguments like we have this morning that investments in climate action are a waste of taxpayer dollars, they are literally saving taxpayer dollars by ensuring that we are mitigating financial and fiscal risk for the federal government down the road. And in fact, the report that you've issued actually states that. In fact, I want to take a direct quote from the report. It says that congressional action has helped to improve this high-risk area, and then goes on to talk about the ways in which the infrastructure bill and presumably the Inflation Reduction Act are actually going to help mitigate fiscal risk to the government. So I really wanted to amplify that this ransom note that the GOP has issued this week on gutting these vital social programs, climate programs, are really going to undermine the fiscal responsibility of the federal government. But I do want to allow the opportunity for you to share some of the findings of the report, especially around climate change. I know there were 5 key areas that were in need of improvement, particularly around government-wide planning and technical assistance to our communities. It's something that I work on every day. I have a number of bills that I'm working on. And so, Mr. Dodaro, could you and staff please expand on some of the key things that we can do to address our fiscal responsibilities around climate change?
I'm going to ask Mr. Gaffigan to do that. He's our expert in the area, but we've got some good ideas.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our high-risk designation on climate, it's about the fiscal exposure. So you're spot on in terms of highlighting that. And the federal government can provide a lot of incentives to build resilience and save those dollars that you're talking about. It can also be an integrator for all the stakeholders who are involved in that, and also provide key information. Those are 3 sort of key areas of resilience that we can build in. But I think the fiscal exposure is a huge issue, and it's why we put it on the high-risk list in 2013.
Yeah, I think a couple specifics. One would be to give better climate information to state and local officials so that they can make better planning decisions. Also to work with them to build the better building codes in. You know, the federal government does not control the building codes. And so it's very important that the federal government try to provide information to get those building codes up to speed. And also the federal government needs to set priorities. There's a lot to do here. And we need priorities. We can't, that would help us to make the most optimal investments.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And we really appreciate your work on this issue. And as I said, this is a significant investment in the future of this country and mitigating financial risk to our country's fiscal health, but also to ensuring that our communities have a livable planet. And so we appreciate your work highlighting that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. You and I have done a lot of work on some key issues, particularly in the high-risk area, and I just want to know, it's been very frustrating, the lack of response in some cases. And I just want to know if there's some common themes or patterns that you have noticed across high-risk areas when compiling the list in recent years.
Yes, one thing is the programs that rely upon state and local administrations are among the most difficult to deal with. This would be Medicaid, unemployment insurance program, because we allow the states to design their own programs within certain parameters. So it's very difficult, and a lot of the federal agencies have a little bit of a softer posture in terms of oversight when there's a lot of responsibilities delegated to the state and local government, but you really need federal leadership in a more aggressive manner. So that's number one. Number two is I think there needs to be more resources brought to bear and more disciplined management of federal programs and activities on spending in normal programs, but on emergencies, which we've have had and will continue to have. And that's the basis for the 10 legislative suggestions I put before the Congress.
Well, in regard to the emergency, it raises a question about the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Has that worsened our ability to manage vulnerable funds? And you mentioned one of them, the unemployment insurance fraud that took place on a massive scale.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, the pandemic exposed fundamental management weaknesses that the federal government has in the payment process in normal times. One is the emphasis has been on pay and chase in the fraud area, rather than preventing fraud in the first place. I've tried to change that, working with the Congress and the agencies. We're nowhere near where we need to be in preventing fraud in the first place.
Well, that's some of the stuff that you and I have worked on over the years is how do we incentivize federal agencies to prevent the improper payments that I think you're really talking about right now, the pay and chase. And I think one of the things that GAO pointed out was that so much of that is just failure to verify eligibility on things, right. Poor paperwork, just administrative errors, but also antiquated data systems.
Right.
And I'm still interested in pursuing a way to incentivize agencies rather than punish agencies that don't pursue this. But what is the GAO's current estimate of improper payments?
The government-wide estimates based on what the agencies have done for the last fiscal year was $247 billion. The previous year was $280 billion. But as I mentioned to the chairman, those estimates aren't complete. So I think the number is much higher.
So, okay, you estimate it's much higher. Let's just say it's between 250 and 300 billion per year. Just at a static level, we're talking over a 10-year period, $2.5 to $3 trillion. And what people need to understand about this is $2.5 to $3 trillion over 10 years that we're having to borrow and pay interest on. And when we're trying to deal with the debt limit and trying to get our fiscal house in order, recognizing the enormous impact it's going to have on our capital markets, that's a pretty significant number. That's a pretty big hill that we need to climb. And I'd like for the committee to continue to work with the GAO to come up with a way to incentivize federal agencies to address this issue. And I think one place that we could start, Mr. Chairman, is on updating the antiquated data systems, because part of the problem I think, Mr. Dodaro, you and I ran into was the lack of ability for interface between data systems between state and federal government. So I think we've got some real opportunities here. I have some other questions I may submit in writing relative to some of the things that my Democrat colleagues have said that I want to evaluate a little bit deeper. But I do think that we don't pay enough attention to how much money is going out of the Treasury in improper payments, and we're doing pay and chase rather than prevention. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Ballant from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Dodaro. Appreciate your time. The Postal Service is a lifeline for rural communities like mine in Vermont. My neighbors in Vermont rely on Postal Service for essentials like medication and for many folks who run small businesses, out of their homes. And the continued viability of the Postal Service, especially in rural parts of this country, is one of my top priorities. Now, thanks to leadership on this committee, including our chairman, Mr. Comer, and former chair, Carolyn Maloney, the Postal Service Reform Act of 2022 was actually a really great bipartisan success story of the last Congress. And I want to dive in a little bit more on the Postal Service. Mr. Dodaro, how long has the Postal Service been on the high-risk list?
The most recent, I think, was 2009 we added it. Actually, if you go back in time, we added it a long time ago. I'll get you the specific date, but then we took them off after some congressional action, but then they deteriorated further. I remember because I actually was called by the Postmaster General at the time, and I was acting Comptroller General at that time, and he actually asked us to consider putting him back on the list.
Yeah.
And we did. We made our own independent judgment.
And Mr. Dodaro, how did the Postal Service Reform Act in 2022 contribute to the significant progress in the high-risk area, so that we can understand that a little bit better?
Yeah, well, it eliminated the requirement for pre-funding health care benefits, and it forgave the amount of money that they owed to that fund in that area. It also shifted some of the responsibilities to the Medicare program, so that it was mostly in the healthcare area. So, but there are a lot of things that down the road it didn't deal with that are going to need to be dealt with. For example, the healthcare benefits issue around the 2030 time frames, that fund's going to run out of money because there's no pre-funding into it. So at that point, the Postal Service is trying to estimate what it would cost to pay out of their operating revenue, which would be about $5 billion a year. I mean, they're already losing money, so they're not going to be able to deal with that. I mean, the first-class mail has been declining. It's not expected to turn around. Packages, the competition there is keen, and coming out of the pandemic, the package revenue is going down. Now, the only revenue increase is due to the tax, or the increases in the price of postage. So they have problems. They're still in debt in a number of areas. So the basic business model isn't sound going forward in the future. Congress gave it some life for a period of time, but the underlying problem is still there and needs to be dealt with. I'll ask Mr. Trimble if he has any additional comments.
No, I think that covers the main points. I think just in terms of the longer-term challenges that they face, currently their long-term liabilities and debt is over $144 billion. And they're projected to lose in fiscal 23 about $4.5 billion. And so when the health benefit fund runs out, if you're already running a deficit of $4.5 billion, you have to add another $5 billion on top of that. You can see the challenges that they're currently facing.
Well, I appreciate that. One of the things that I always say about Vermont is that we run on duct tape, twine, and hundreds of hours of volunteer time, from Vermonters across the state. And we are cheap by nature. We're thrifty. And I just want to convey that there are lots of rural communities, just like the one that I live in, Vermont, that depend on the Postal Service for their very survival. And so I certainly understand the concerns about how the business model is not working. And as we made progress, I think, by my count, more than $1 billion in financial benefits came to taxpayers since 2006. because of progress in the high-risk areas, and I appreciate that as a thrifty Vermonter, but I just want to plant a flag in the ground and say we cannot let the Postal Service die on the vine. Rural America is depending on us to figure this out.
I understand that. I understand that. And, you know, my motto at GAO is elegant but cheap.
I like
it. But we also, like any Vermonters who want to come to work at GAO, it's a good place to practice their thriftiness. But also, the fundamental issue here, you know, if you look back in history, Postal Service was a government entity.
Yes.
In the beginning. And then somebody said, oh, well, we can do better in having a private sector model in this area. And it worked well until it didn't.
Right.
And so I think Congress is going to have to come to grips with what model do we want to have if we want to guarantee level of service to the American people, and who's going to pay for it.
Yeah.
And that is the decision down the road that's inevitable in this case. And what we're saying is the sooner Congress deals with that issue, the better.
Agreed. Last comment, just, you know, we did great work in a bipartisan manner on this issue in the past. I want to continue to work on this. It is really not an overstatement to say that rural America depends on the Postal Service. It's a critical infrastructure, and we got to come together. We got to continue to come together in a bipartisan manner on this issue. Thank you.
I agree.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Before I yield to Mr. Sessions, I would like to point out I spoke with Postmaster General DeJoy last night, and we hope to bring him in front of at least subcommittee hearing within the next month or so, maybe 2 months, whatever the calendar will permit. So I think that's a very good point that you all discussed, and it's something that this committee has legislative jurisdiction on. We're going to have to take very seriously. We passed the bipartisan legislation, but there's still things I think that need to be done. So I appreciate that. Chair recognizes Mr. Sessions from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. By the way, I'm probably one of a few members that sat on the old Postal subcommittee when we saw this happening, but because we were not bipartisan, the answer did not happen. Mr. Dondero, welcome back. It's good to see you again, Gene, and thank you for your service to this nation as well as your colleagues. During both the committee hearing at which you testified in February and subsequent hearing in the Government Operations Subcommittee, which I chaired, we heard that self-certification was a leading cause of fraud in the unemployment insurance program during the COVID pandemic. Thus, it would make sense not to rely on self-certification in the future, and yet the Biden administration is proposing to allow applicants for student loan forgiveness to self-certify for this benefit. Look, I get it. The Supreme Court may decide the Biden administration does not have the authority to forgive student loans. However, it concerns me that we may be poised for another big giveaway because we're relying on self-certification. Would the gentleman please address this issue?
I, too, was concerned. So I've commissioned a GAO study to look at what the proposed operating procedures would be if they are given the green light by the Supreme Court to go through an income-driven program. And so we'll have a report out on that soon. So I share your concern on that, particularly given what happened in both the unemployment insurance and the Paycheck Protection Program and the EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Plus, we've seen before on the income-driven repayment plans at the Education Department where they relied on so didn't verify the incomes, that a lot of people who reported zero income really didn't have zero income. And so we made a number of recommendations there that they have better procedures to verify the income, and the department's in the process of implementing those recommendations. So you're right to be concerned. I was. We're looking at it, and hopefully we'll have some recommendations if they go forward with that program that can provide better safeguards.
Mr. Dondero, thank you very much. In fact, the subcommittee and this committee would welcome that. As you may recall from the subcommittee hearing, it was virtually a unanimous, bipartisan viewpoint that what happened in this process of the D18 group and the things that occurred was not in the best interest of anyone except people who fraudulently received that money. So I want you to know that we will work, and I'll work with our young chairman and our young ranking member, as well as Mr. Mfume and myself, on putting together a letter that we would like to make sure that is accompanying your feedback. I think it's important that internally your team make sure that they understand that your report is coming, that we look at it the same way, that we try and authorize this in such a way to where we're all together, including the administration, not just Congress. So thank you very much. Sir, has the GAO looked at the Department of Education's self-certification, the one we were just talking about, and have they come up with any realistic viewpoint about where they might also unto themselves recognize this did not work the right way?
You mean from the Education Department officials?
Right.
Yeah.
Have they indicated, whoops, didn't quite work the way we wanted, or are they still out there following this? Look, we're going to continue this process.
Yeah, I don't know specifically the answer to that question. I will talk to the team and get a response back to you. I do know that there was some balking at cooperation with us in the first place. And, you know, because they were concerned that this might provide a roadmap for people to commit fraud. And I was saying, that's not my goal. My goal is to help you prevent fraud in the first place. So what their exact posture is right now at the working level, I don't know, but I'll get you an answer.
Thank you. I think that insight helps the six of us or the four of us up here as we attempt to provide our written guidance. I want to thank you for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for joining us today in this important hearing. Waste, fraud, and abuse in our system, obviously must be taken seriously. The American people work too hard for their paychecks. They pay their fair share in taxes, or at least the 99% pays their fair share in taxes, and we should be working to ensure that tax money is used to actually benefit them. Yet Republicans on this committee will decry the need for oversight on our programs and in the same breath support Speaker McCarthy's debt ceiling legislation that's on the floor this week. Rather than help further the goals GOA lays out in the high-risk list, this bill seeks to impose drastic across-the-board cuts to critical government programs and significantly disrupt agency work that addresses the identified problems. Mr. Dodaro, in GOA's 2023 high-risk list, you outline the financial benefits that making progress on high-risk areas can yield. Since 2006, how much in financial benefits have actions on high-risk areas yielded for taxpayers?
$675 billion.
Thank you. I want to emphasize what the Comptroller General just stated. Addressing high-risk areas has provided taxpayers $675 billion in financial benefits. Mr. Dodaro, what factors do you include when you calculate financial benefits?
We include savings, cost savings, better use of the resources. We also account for revenue collections that may have come in as a result of our recommendations, and it has included revenue enhancements as well.
So the financial benefits tracked by GOA are more than just savings. They could mean reduced government expenditures, increased revenues of that limited government funds can be reallocated to higher priority areas. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What are one or two examples of recommendations from this year's high-risk list that could produce financial benefits and improve services for taxpayers if implemented correctly?
There's a number. We've had a number, for example, in the Medicare area. We think that if you equalize payments by place of service, right now, if you go to a medical appointment at a doctor who's affiliated with a hospital, as opposed to a doctor who's operating their own practice in a private building, the government will pay more for the same level of service to the doctor at the hospital physician, and we think there's tens of billions of dollars that could be saved there as well. I think, you know, there's a number of savings we had if the Congress would act to give the Energy Department more authority to look at how we dispose of nuclear waste at the Hanford site, that there's a cheaper way to do it that would save tens of billions of dollars, if not more, in disposing of that low-level activity waste at the Hanford site. This is waste that's been accumulated since World War II and the buildup of our nuclear weapon system. So those are two big examples of where there are big dollars.
Thank you. Just in closing, an ineffective government causes more than just a headache for its citizens. It can mean people have to wait longer for tax refunds that they desperately need, or that it takes longer to travel somewhere because of our crumbling roads and our bridges, something Pittsburghers know all too well. The answer is clear. We can't drop the ball when it comes to oversight of our programs. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Mace from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we're here today to talk about government accountability, oversight, transparency. We've heard about cybersecurity issues and fraudulent payments on Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. And then our friends across the aisle want to start banging Republicans over the head over absolute nonsense and accuse us of wanting to literally take food out of babies' mouths, I think is what I heard earlier today. If I recall, it was under the current administration last year when there was a massive baby formula shortage, literally taking food out of the mouths of babies during that shortage. And if I recall during the baby formula shortage that we even had, under the Biden administration, Border Patrol agents that were literally holding baby formula imports hostage, where I had to call the Border Patrol and get baby formula released from the Border Patrol so that babies could have the formula that they needed. So to hijack this hearing over those issues is utter nonsense. We also heard others across the aisle talking about, you know, how Republicans want tax breaks for the wealthy. Well, you know, one of the greatest tax breaks for the wealthy was under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, where there were $250 billion of tax breaks for the wealthiest 1%. That's $26,000 in SALT tax cuts for millionaires, a almost $13,000 government subsidy for couples who are making $500,000 a year to buy their luxury electric vehicles, taxpayer-funded subsidies for the wealthy for home buying, child care, pre-K, Obamacare, paid leave, and more. So I really don't want to hear about the hypocrisy of the left on this issue at all. The IRA mentions taxes, fees, and penalties 637 times. It was the largest expansion of the federal government in 50 years. There were over 150 new government programs. And today the debate rages on about the debt ceiling, but Americans wouldn't recognize it. Americans are living paycheck to paycheck right now. They can't afford a platinum credit card with no limits, and yet that's what the federal government is doing today. The debate is not about, you know, not raising the debt ceiling. The debate is about how much to raise the debt ceiling by. The debate is not about how soon to balance the budget. The debate is not about that at all. It's not about fixing Washington's out-of-control spending, which, by the way, is bipartisan, because under President Trump, he raised the debt by $8 trillion. Under President Biden, over $4 trillion. $12 trillion added to the debt over the last 6 years. And we have to deal with nonsense in this committee when we're trying to talk about ways that we can reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in the American government system. American families who run a business or run their family budgets, they understand something that the Congress does not. They cannot run on a deficit. They have to balance their checkbooks every single week. And I'm not going to give my teenage kids a platinum credit card with no limits whatsoever. And to see this debate politicized rather than having both sides come together on both sides of the aisle to say, what are we going to do to fix the debt and the spending crisis that both sides have created today? And it's absolute crickets from our friends across the aisle on the left. And so now that I have gotten totally off on the other side because the importance of this hearing is important. I do want to get to you, Mr. Dodaro, on some of this. You mentioned cybersecurity as being an issue, and I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on this issue. You know, one of the things that we brought up on this committee is the aging workforce in the federal workforce and also the workforce that isn't showing up to work, actually. But you know, in the private sector, they don't have this issue where you have 4 times the number of federal workforce employees in IT that are over the age of 60 that will be entering retirement soon versus those that are under the age of 30. I mean, how big of an issue is this going to be in the next couple of years?
I think it's a very important issue and point. In fact, strategic human capital management is on the high-risk list across the federal government. I'm very concerned about the federal workforce. Less than 7% are under 30. At GAO, I might add, it's over 10. But, you know, because I've been focused on this as well. This is a real problem for the federal government. There are 22 areas of the 37 on the high-risk list because of critical skill gaps and shortages. Government-wide in the cybersecurity area, human capital management, acquisition management, and there's individual agency skill gaps in a lot of critical agencies across the government. So this is a real problem that the government has, and I'm concerned about it.
And the last thing I will add, I only have 10 seconds left. I was learning COBOL in the late 90s. I was a programmer during Y2K, and back then in the late 90s, those were legacy systems.
Yes.
And the number of systems that we have on COBOL and the advent of technology, even AI, and accessing our vulnerabilities and keeping data safe and secure is something else that we need to explore. I know your office is on top of it, so we really appreciate the reports you've been putting out and bringing cybersecurity to the forefront of this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's entirely appropriate that the Democratic minority on this committee be talking about the potential impeding crash of the American economy and the global economy if the American government, for the first time ever, doesn't pay its bills. I think if anything should be on the high-risk list, that's probably number one, would be if this Congress, led by the Republican majority, forces a default for the first time ever against the American people by this Congress not paying our bills. And so if we want to have conversation here about making sure we don't have tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans or the biggest corporations, I think that would have enormous support here from the Democratic minority. I think it'd be great for us to talk about repealing the last of the Trump tax scam, which we know benefited the top 1% of 1%. Our colleague here, Congressman Jimmy Gomez, recently introduced the 99.5% Act, which would close loopholes on the estate tax and end benefits for those billionaires that continue to avoid paying their fair share every single year. That is, of course, not in Mr. Dodaro's report because that isn't part of your gig, but since it was brought up, I think really important for us to say here that that is an extremely high risk to the American economy and to the federal government if for the first time ever folks refuse to pay, the Republican majority refuses to pay America's bills, basically holding things like SNAP benefits for ransom over it, which would take food out of children's mouths and seniors' mouths, and holding things like veterans' health care hostage. One thing, just to get back to my line of questioning here for you, Mr. Dodaro, your report rightly highlights the fact that the climate crisis is having a devastating impact on our communities. In Central Texas, 100-year floods. Now we really call every couple of year floods. We've had 3 of those in the last 10 years. So your report says that FEMA really needs to update its work in order to address things like wildfires and floods. Tell us, would FEMA be able to achieve some of your recommendations and do the work that you all are tasking it to do if its budget were cut by, say, 22%? How would that impact FEMA's ability and other agencies' ability to achieve your recommendations to deal with climate?
Yeah, it would definitely complicate their efforts by how much, I don't know. It depends on whether or not they have carryover money left or multi-year funding that's available. But FEMA workforce has been a particular problem over the years, and we've written a lot about the current gap. They'd have difficulty, staffing if we had, multiple disasters, but they have special resources they could call on. But the biggest issue, though, there on the high-risk list is flood insurance. And given what you said, I'm going to ask Ms. Horace Williams-Browns to talk about what we think needs to be done in the flood insurance area. Horace?
In the National Flood Insurance Program, this is a program that's been on the list for many years, basically following Katrina. It's a federal program, and basically the federal government stepped into the space because there was a lack of a private market, because no surprise, you're quite familiar, flooding can be unpredictable, but flooding is also the great equalizer. And the challenge with the program is balancing affordability with sustainability of the program. And FEMA's been unable to charge actuarially sound rates. They've taken some steps recently to improve the rate setting process, and that increases premiums, but it also makes sure that the premiums reflect the risk of flooding. And this is an area that FEMA can only do so much. It does also require a federal intervention in terms of addressing a number of issues related to the program.
With the goal being you don't want your flood insurance to be unaffordable, nor do you want the program to be insolvent.
Exactly.
And so, I would assume that a 22% cut to something like FEMA would make that even more challenging.
It would make administering the program challenging.
And so again, I think it is entirely appropriate for the Democrats in the hearing here today to be raising that massive cuts to programs like FEMA will make addressing flood insurance harder. It will make it harder to make sure your flood insurance isn't unaffordable, harder to make sure your the flood insurance program isn't insolvent, harder for us to deal with crop insurance as we see our crops suffer from the climate crisis, along with consistent attacks on basic programs like SNAP, which most folks know as food stamps. We want to make sure that we have teachers in our schools. We want to make sure that folks are able to put food on the table, and we want to make sure that folks are able to be more and more resilient from all of these disasters. We've gone through floods and freezes, gone through the entire electric grid in Texas shutting down, and we need to be expanding these programs, not curtailing them. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. Your report suggests that as of December 2021, DoD expected to spend more than $1.9 trillion to acquire weapons systems. Over what time period is this spending expected?
I'm going to ask Mr. DiNapoli, our expert in that area, to respond. Tim?
Thank you for that question. It's a difficult one to answer because most of those weapon systems, that equates to a life cycle cost, so that can stretch out for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So it is a long period of time.
So as you look at it, have you made any modification vis-a-vis the use of weapons from our stockpile in the Ukrainian crisis?
So as we mentioned before, that we do have a body of work ongoing, taking a look at not only what's been provided to the Ukrainian armed forces, but also what we're doing to replenish the stocks that we've taken them from.
So tell us what the result of your reanalysis or modification would be.
It is still ongoing, so we can't actually give you the final results, but we are looking at ways in which, how they determine which stocks would be provided from where, how we're going to, whether we replenish them with new stocks, we're just going to let them draw down, how we're going to buy those new stocks, and how we're going to, and when they're going to be available back to the armed forces.
Have you made any recommendations?
Not of yet in that particular area.
So on DoD financial management, you indicated that DoD has longstanding issues, including ineffective processes, systems, and controls, incomplete corrective actions, and the need for more effective monitoring and reporting. And I think you testified to Mr. Grothman regarding their failure of an audit in 2022. And you have flagged, DoD financial management has been flagged as high risk since 1995. Your report states that financial management issues extend beyond reporting as, quote, longstanding control deficiencies adversely affect the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of its operations, close quote. You state that 67 recommendations remain open within DoD financial management, and that implementation of previous recommendations has resulted in a savings of nearly $4 billion in taxpayer dollars. Can you provide an estimate of the cost to taxpayers for the unimplemented recommendations?
Yeah, we can look at that issue and give you an estimate. Yeah, we have done that across GAO, so I'd be happy to provide that to the committee.
Yeah, I would love to see that, because, I mean, they implemented a few of them and saved $4 billion. I'd like to know what the cost of failure to implement 60-some odd.
Yeah, we'll do.
Thank you. On business system modernization, your report states that DoD spends billions each year to acquire and modernize business systems. However, significant challenges impede DoD's efforts to improve the systems environment. And you highlight 3 critical challenges: improving business systems acquisition, improving business systems investment management, and leveraging DoD's federated business enterprise architecture. Can you provide an estimate of the cost to taxpayers for unimplemented recommendations within DoD's business system modernization efforts?
We'll have to provide that for the record.
Okay, I look forward to seeing that. You also state that weaknesses in management of contracts, finances, supply chain, support acquisition, and weapons systems acquisition adversely affect DoD's efficiency, effectiveness, and render its operations vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse, which in turn affects the readiness and capabilities of U.S. military forces. Can you discuss the final impact in more depth? What is the effect of waste within the Department of Defense on military readiness? And then I would ask if you're familiar with a study that was released, or where they estimated $125 billion a year was being wasted in DoD. That's not an official GAO. That is a journalist estimate. So I'm curious if you're familiar with that as well.
Yeah. We took a look at the study you're referring to. We'll provide some information for the record on that. It's been a while, but I remember what you're referring to, and we'll take a look at it and give you an answer for the record.
Yeah, I would really appreciate that, because I would guess, I don't know whether they're accurate or not with $125 billion a year, but if they are, and we've had, and that was, I think it was a 2015 study.
Yeah.
So that's 8 years, and we've had inflation since then. I would imagine that the waste, fraud, corruption, duplication, whatever you want to call it, has probably increased. I would really like to know where GAO, where you stand on that, what you're finding, and I would look forward to getting that. When might I expect that?
We should be able to provide something to you within the next month.
Okay, 30 days?
Yes, that's a month. I'll go with 30 rather than 31. But that's fine.
I was hoping for you were going to say 30 minutes, but I guess I'll take 30 days.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Too often when I sit in this room listening to my colleagues on the right, I ask myself, why are we having this hearing? But today is a little different, or is it? I applaud my Republican colleagues for conducting this hearing because GAO reports highlight the reasons why we cannot and should not pass the GOP's budget bill this week. You see, my colleagues on the right want their cake and they want to eat it too. I call it hypocrisy and hype. They want to use this committee as an arm of the RNC for 2024, but they don't want to provide the American people with the actual substantive solutions. They want to point out issues in the federal government, but they don't want to give the resources to fix the problems of the American people. So let's take a look at one issue that I know my constituents care about: taxes and getting their tax refunds. I'm not even going to say tax returns. They want their refunds. Like my constituents in Texas 30 last week, I had to file my tax returns with the IRS, and like them, I want to make sure that I get my money, which ain't really anyway. But according to the GAO report that is the focus of today's hearing, the IRS, quote, needs to increase its capacity to implement new initiatives, improve ongoing enforcement and taxpayer service programs, and combat identity theft and refund fraud, unquote. I have no doubt federal employees at the IRS work hard to ensure Americans' tax refunds go into the right hands. How do I know this? Because my mom is one of those federal employees that works for the IRS. And honestly, she's the hardest working woman that I know. But even with this GAO high-risk report that one of my colleagues wanted to have a hearing on today cites that the primary reason for declines in audit rates and roughly $50 million to $250 million in payments by the government to fraudulent tax returns is because of reduced staffing due to decreased funding, because last time I checked, ain't nobody trying to work for free. So how would my Republican colleagues plan to fix this? Well, just this past January, they voted to defund the IRS even more, slashing $80 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Democrats last Congress. And now Republicans are using the GOP budget bill to cut this $80 billion to the IRS. On top of how ridiculous this solution is, I'm not even surprised that the CBO projected that in cutting this funding, the Republican budget bill would add $114 billion to the national deficit. Simply put, if Republicans really cared about fiscal responsibility and protecting American taxpayer dollars, they would put their money where their mouth is. But as we know, their budget bill represents their priorities, and it's clear that their priorities are to protect wealthy tax cheats instead of throwing the federal hammer down on them. At the end of the day, I am here to do a job, and that's to protect my constituents. So I'd like to close out by asking our witnesses the following questions. Mr. Dodaro, what steps must Congress take to combat identity theft and fraud through the IRS and improve agency efficiencies so that people can get their refunds?
We have a number of recommendations for that Congress in that area. You know, one would be to require additional electronic filing. You know, rather than have the paper returns, keyed in. That's an inefficient process and induces errors into the process. I'll ask Mr. McTighe to elaborate a little bit further. But one additional thing is to give IRS the authority to set requirements for paid tax preparers. Many of the unenrolled paid tax preparers actually have greater error rates than people preparing their own taxes. So I think it would be provided better oversight over that area, and to also require more third-party information reporting so IRS could match against the records. That would provide more accurate and timely responses. Jay, would you have any additions?
Those are the key ones. I guess the one additional comment I would make, Congress could provide IRS with greater authority to correct simple math errors where taxpayers have inadvertently made errors. Information differs from what IRS or the government has in its databases, and that would not only help in terms of IRS's administration, but it also would reduce the burden on taxpayers to address those errors through correspondence and back and forth with the IRS. Obviously, taxpayers need to have protections and the ability to interact with IRS too.
I understand. Thank you so much, and you would agree that IRS needs resources to be able to carry out these plans, correct?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I was just saying you would agree with me that the IRS does need resources in order to effectuate these plans, correct?
GAO has long pointed out that, IRS does receive considerable resources, and it's imperative that they use the resources that they have most efficiently and effectively. But that can only go so far, particularly with the growth in the economy and the growth in the number of taxpayers.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Dodaro, great to see you. Thank you for coming before us to discuss a matter of the utmost importance. I commend you and your staff on the work that was put into this year's high-risk report. Many of the wasteful government programs that you identified here today have been discussed and rightfully criticized. Discussions are good and can be effective. However, discussions require follow-through to be effective. Unfortunately, Congress and the executive branch have been missing the bar when it comes to follow-through for decades. As you know, my colleague, Rep. Kilmer, and I worked on legislation contained in last year's NDAA that requires GAO to provide succinct priority recommendation reports to congressional committees. These reports would be organized by topic and contain the amount of time a priority recommendation has been open for and a cost savings estimate, among other things. So my first question is, how many total priority recommendations produced by the GAO remain outstanding? What recommendations has been outstanding the longest, and how long is that?
There's hundreds of open priority recommendations. I'd have to go back and look at the winner, if you will, who's been open the longest. There's a number to go back a number of years. It's years. It's years.
10 years or less?
Well, I don't know, and I'm not going to guess. We don't guess at GAO. We'll give you the facts.
I'll give you another one. What recommendation that hasn't been addressed concerns you the most?
There's a number in that could save a lot of money. The one I mentioned earlier in the Medicare area, where we're paying people differently based on place of service for the same service. That doesn't seem to be a good practice on the part of the federal government. Secondly, would be the one I just mentioned on IRS, which is to give IRS to set requirements for paid tax preparers. I think that would generate additional revenue for the federal government without any additional costs, and it'd be a more fair and equitable tax system. The one on Hanford is important too, because that has, in low-level radioactive waste disposal, that has tens of billions of dollars in potential benefits.
I know you don't like guessing, but what if we implemented all of the recommendations you've made? How much do you think that would save the federal government?
Between 30 billion and 100 billion.
So we should implement these recommendations.
I don't have to guess on that. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How much of this falls on congressional inaction compared to the executive branch agencies?
It falls, about equally. There's a number of open recommendations for the Congress as well as the agencies. Most of the big dollar savings, though, would have to require congressional action.
So in regards to the initial report from the legislation that was signed into law last year in the NDAA, how far along is it, and when do you think Congress should expect to receive it?
You'll have it in June.
In June?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to transition to PPP fraud. Obviously, tens of billions, possibly $100 billion was stolen through the PPP loan program. And I actually introduced the PPP Shell Company Discovery Act, which basically forces communication between SBA, IRS, and DOJ. And I think that's just one step in reclaiming fraudulent payments. I guess my question is the SBA fit to mitigate fraud in future emergency situations? Did we learn anything?
Yes, so we learned quite a bit. SBA is trying to put in place a better fraud management framework that meets GAO best practices. We've had several conversations with the current administrator. They've finally designated an entity, but it's not fully staffed yet. They still have to do some more work. But yes, I think we've learned some things. We're trying to put in place better practices over there. And I'm encouraged, but we're not where we need to be yet, fully.
In retrospect, do you think that we should have given, the CARES Act should have given SBA access to some documents from a limited nature from the IRS to prevent what was hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud? Would that have fixed it?
That would have made a big start on it. For example, they were prohibited by Congress from using tax transcripts in the emergency or the economic injury disaster loan program, where they used them for the normal program, and that put them at a big disadvantage. Even though Congress corrected that later, it still took them months to be able to get that back as control.
Sure, thank you. I yield, and with that, the chair now recognizes Mr. Frost, Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues called this hearing to look at GAO's high-risk list, a place where no government agency should be, and I commend the Biden administration for making historic improvements over the past 2 years to get agencies off of this list and welcome the opportunity to help address some others. I also understand the concern of my Republican colleagues. 3 new areas were added to the high-risk list, and one in particular, the federal prison system. And, I'm kind of glad in this new interest I'm seeing from Republicans on this committee that are showing interest in how incarcerated people are being treated, even if it seems that that started just about 2 years ago on January 6th. Some of us fight against mass incarceration, unjust prison conditions, and a lack of reentry resources on behalf of our loved ones, friends, and constituents behind bars. It seems like Republicans are looking to do it only for insurrectionists. But regardless of how you got here, welcome to the fight. Mr. Dodaro, I'm curious, in the high-risk list, the GAO notes that the Bureau of Prisons hasn't evaluated programs for incarcerated folks in decades. According to the GAO, the Bureau of Prisons has a long-standing challenges, including several leadership changes, unsound stewardship of financial resources, and poor planning and evaluation of programs to help incarcerated people successfully return to society and their community. What changed in your assessment of their failures that elevated the Bureau of Prisons to high risk?
Well, one was the fact that this has been occurring over a period of time. I was very concerned about that. We also looked at the implementation of the First Step Act and waited actually until their original implementation of that act. You know, you mentioned leadership changes. They've had 6 directors in 6 different years. The staffing problems, the use of extensive use of overtime led to safety concerns both for the inmates and the staff. And I'll ask Charles Johnson, our expert, to elaborate a little bit more.
Yes, thank you, Controller General. And Congressman, as the Controller General mentioned, there has been longstanding staffing challenges. One of the recommendations we made was that the BOP needed to collect better data, and be able to monitor and come up with a real need at which they are able to calculate their staffing needs. Currently, we're finding that they've been authorized about 40,000 personnel, and they're roughly at about 35,000. So they have a 15% gap in their staffing levels, which does impact the safety and security not only of the individuals incarcerated, but their personnel as well. There's a massive use of overtime. Overtime has increased about 100%, and we felt like they needed to also assess their use of overtime and the impact that overtime has on their operations as well, among a lot of factors as well.
Thank you. And I understand that before assigning a high-risk designation, GAO assesses the effectiveness of an agency's planned or ongoing corrective actions. Mr. Dodaro, since the Bureau of Prisons was elevated to the high-risk list, has there been any signals of positive change or compliance with legal requirements?
I was very encouraged. I met with the new director of the Bureau of Prisons. We talked about this. I was impressed with her commitment to addressing these issues. They're working on some detailed plans to address this area. We're going to work with them and agree on a set of specific metrics that we're going to follow to determine when we take them off the high-risk list, because it not only takes leadership commitment, it has to take capacity, an action plan, and actual monitoring and demonstrating some results. So I think we're going to lay a good framework in place. Once we have those metrics, I will share them with the Congress, of course.
Thank you. You know, in Florida, we have the 3rd largest prison and incarcerated population in the nation. The Republican legislature in Florida is intent on creating new criminal penalties for reading the wrong books, treating the wrong patients, what they call the wrong patients, and who knows what other infringements on our freedom will come from the state of Florida. Floridians have a large stake in rehabilitation programs simply because we have such a large incarcerated population. What are some actionable steps that the Bureau of Prisons can implement that can contribute to them getting off of the next high-risk list?
They can develop a better staffing model. They can make sure that they have a program evaluation plan for evaluating these programs to help prevent recidivism. You know, their latest estimate shows that about 45% of the population within 3 years after release ends back in prison. And so there's a lot of those areas that they can do, as well as specifying a little bit more about what would qualify for some of the benefits for early release right now that's allowed under the First Step Act.
Thank you. You know, the effective planning and ongoing evaluation of these programs is essential to lower risk of recidivism and ensure formerly incarcerated folks can be integrated back into our communities. Thank you. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, what do you think the estimated total fraud is for the PPP program?
On the PPP program, we don't have a fraud estimate, but there was $36 billion estimated for improper payments. We're looking at, making that. The only one we have a fraud estimate now for is, at the low end, was unemployment insurance, which we estimated was over $60 billion.
And what can we do in the future to prevent the PPP, fraud or mispayments, and also on the unemployment?
First is not allow just total self-certification. That invites fraud. Secondly, was to make sure the agencies implement GAO's framework for preventing fraud in the first place. Secondly, is to require internal control plans that have special procedures for emergency loan programs. We're about ready to issue a report on a framework for that going forward, but I think it would be good if Congress required that framework in law. And also, any new program over $100 million, in my opinion, should be automatically deemed susceptible to improper payments, so that there's an estimate made earlier in the process. Under the current rules, it could be 2 or 3 years before they make an estimate of improper payments. And this is what happened with PPP. I mean, the first time they did it is 2022. You know, they should have begun doing it a lot earlier, but we recommended they do, but they weren't able to do it or didn't do it.
We don't hear a lot in this building, common sense, good sense, so thank you for that. The Department of Defense spends billions of dollars each year to acquire and modernize business systems, including ones that address key, areas such as like personnel, financial management, healthcare, and logistics, et cetera. And in my opinion, every time it seems like the good idea fairy visits the Pentagon, a new colonel gets his wings. I mean, it's massively bureaucratic over there, and I sit on the HASC committee. There's so much duplicative effort over there, and it comes as no surprise to me that we struggle to bridge the kind of the valley of death in a system designed like that. Through your work at the GAO, how do you think the DoD can best streamline business functions at the Pentagon?
Implement leading practices. We do a lot of studies, and I'll ask Tim DiNapoli to come to the table to explain about how we've used leading practices to improve their weapon systems portfolio.
So through the years, as I've mentioned before, DoD has been unable to deliver weapon systems on a timely basis, and cost increases. So what we did for the last 20 years, have gone out to the private sector to look at a variety of companies and see how they develop and produce their systems. By looking at, and the companies that we identify cut across industries, so it's not one particular segment. We try to look for the best companies in particular areas. And what we've been able to do is to distill those practices that are common to leading companies. We've made a series of recommendations through the years for the department to incorporate those. And for the most part, at least in the early years, the department has been able to do that in their policies. They don't follow them on a consistent basis, which means that from a practice perspective, they're not following what the policies are. We're currently updating that work to identify new practices based on new technologies and new information. And we've identified 3 or 4 key things that the department could do in terms of trying to develop weapon systems and field them more quickly. The department has not yet implemented those in their policies. We find mixed in terms of whether or not individual programs are implementing them in their practices. So I think there's a ways to go yet in terms of how weapon systems can be acquired, but that same principle can apply to almost any business modernization system as well.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I think it's obvious that the DoD can learn a lot from the private sector. Do you think that they're looking enough to the private sector for that help and for really just to follow that example? You don't always have to reinvent the wheel.
It's always a challenge, right? Because folks within the department have a legacy system, and they're trying to maintain those.
Yeah.
And so trying to develop new systems requires both the maintaining of the existing, make sure we have those capabilities, and then figuring out a way to implement those new processes in an efficient, effective way. There sometimes is challenges on both sides.
An efficient and effective way. That's what we're after.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important is that we've been trying to impress upon the department the importance of maturing technology before you put it into production. Oftentimes they rush ahead. Now I know that there's pressures to meet peer competition, near peer competition, and other things that force them to do that, but that leads to costly reinvestments down the road where they have to correct things. I mean, the Joint Strike Fighter is a good example of that, and we're looking at the Columbia-class submarine development. That's got some scheduling issues and others. So, but that's an important part as you sit on your assignments on the defense committees to check on is the maturity of the technology before they hit the production button.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Bush from the great state of Missouri.
Yes,
for 5 minutes.
great state of Missouri. All right, St. Louis and I are here today for a timely and important hearing. Mr. Dodaro, it's a pleasure to see you again, and hello to all the GAO staff. Last Congress, we discussed the federal government's obligation to clean up areas where federal activities, including nuclear weapons production, have contaminated the environment. The Department of Energy knew that Coldwater Creek in North St. Louis County was dangerously contaminated in the 1960s, yet it has taken over 60 years to address this crisis. The federal government now faces $626 billion in liabilities for these cleanup responsibilities. For decades, radioactive materials from the first atomic bomb were allowed to seep deadly contamination into Coldwater Creek in my district. Toxic chemicals like radium and uranium continue to threaten the safety and well-being of my constituents and my loved ones in St. Louis. As a result, tens of thousands of people in my community have confirmed or suspected exposure to radioactive waste. That means lung cancer, bone cancer, leukemia, breast cancer, skin cancer, and that's just to name a few of the tragic impacts. Far beyond the monetary cost, I know the human toll that this high-risk area takes because I've lived it and my constituents continue to live it every single day. We're not talking about a distant problem. I am in this room. I lived by the creek for a number of years. Even when I moved a few minutes away, the fully finished basement of my new townhouse would flood with potentially radioactive water. My son's room was in that basement. Our children are not safe living near the graveyard of an atomic bomb factory. Mr. Dodaro, what progress has been made on the Coldwater Creek issues, which remains on the high-risk list since 2021?
Ask Mr. Gaffigan, our expert, to respond, please.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And we discussed this 2 years ago.
We did.
We did. And at your request, we've been looking at this issue. Coldwater Creek is one of 20 FUSRAP sites, which were the commercial side of the Manhattan Project that have left a legacy of waste, not only in your state, but 7 other states. So we are currently undergoing a review of the Corps. The Army Corps is charged with the cleanup of these 20 sites, and we're looking at Coldwater Creek and all the sites and all these communities and assessing where they are and assessing the environmental liabilities, where the risks are. Are they following leading practices for doing the cleanup? And what is the engagement with the community, the communication and sharing with the folks of what's going on? So we're looking at all those issues, and we visited Coldwater Creek in November of 2022, talked to the residents there and the cleanup officials, and we expect to report to you in August of 23 on the status of that project as well as the others.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that info. All right. And we know, as we know, some progress has been made. Much more still needs to be done just across the board. Last October, high levels of radioactive exposure were detected in samples taken from the library, from the kitchen, classrooms, fields, and playground of Jana Elementary School in my district. The school has since been permanently shut down. Mr. Dodaro, or what more can the federal government do to tackle this serious issue? Or it can go to, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And that's one of the things we're looking at. I know there have been several studies done just to that elementary school and what's going on. And I think that'll be encompassed in our report as well because of contamination from that site.
Okay, thank you. Yesterday, I introduced the bipartisan, bicameral Justice for Jana Elementary Act to ensure that potentially radiation-exposed schools in my district are lifted up and not left behind. It will require the federal government to clean up Jana Elementary and test other properties in the school district for contamination. You know, when we think about this issue, while Republicans are working to cut funding that will undermine the federal government's ability to meet its obligations to clean contaminated areas and assist suffering communities like ours, Democrats, we are working to make the federal government, make sure the federal government does more and invests more robust funding to support our communities. Congress and the federal government must meet their hazardous waste cleanup obligations to our communities. Yet Republicans and their Default on America Act would deprive the government of resources to tackle these hazards and put the health and education of yet another generation of children at risk. I want to thank Mr. Dodaro and the GAO for being here today and answering our questions. I yield back.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. There have been several programs that have been mentioned today and in your testimony that have been included in the high-risk list since the 90s. Can you, so the ones I recall is Medicare, the fact there's improper payments, cybersecurity, which is a high risk, strategic human capital management, any others?
The ones from the 1990, original charter list, if you will, was the DoD weapon systems, the tax administration, Department of Energy contracting system, NASA's acquisition system, and Medicare.
Okay, and so have any of these agencies fallen off the list? Which
Well,
ones?
these are the ones that are currently on the list.
That have been there since the 90s?
Yeah, there was 14 on the original 1990. I'm talking about just the original 1990 list. There were 14, 6 are left. So eight have come off the list over time. And we've had, and in total, have been about 27 areas we've designated over time that have come off the list. There's a complete list in the report on when they came off the list.
So is there any factors that are in common with the 6 that are remaining on the list? Any structural issues with those?
Yeah, there's some inherent risk, associated with those issues. Weapon systems are one-of-a-kind kind of things that are developed. Medicare is a large and growing program with, thousands of, if not millions of transactions every year, with those programs. But they're all unique. There really is not one single thing but I would also, point out that in those 6 areas, even though they're still on the list, there's been a lot of progress made and some of the financial benefits. We mentioned the $675 billion that's been saved since 2006. Some of them a significant part of them have come from those 6 programs.
Oh, that's promising to hear because, seeing that they've been on this since the 90s is discouraging. But do you have any issues with agencies ignoring the fact that they're on the list? Is there any punishment or anything that happens when an agency is identified and placed on the high risk?
Yeah, the only statutory requirement is that if GAO puts something on the high risk list, that the OMB needs to do a portfolio review of that issue. And so we've been having regular meetings with OMB, the agencies on the high risk list, and GAO. I personally participate in those meetings. But other than that, there's no quote penalty. Nobody ignores us. We won't let them. And so, we're working with them. And I'd like to see, the continued leadership commitment. One of the things we take very seriously is, since these are longstanding problems, is to provide transition between administrations of having each successive administration commit to that issue, and I've had good success there.
But if you could implement one measure that would save the United States an enormous amount of money and eliminate a lot of opportunity for fraud, of all the things, what would you say?
Equalizing the payment process by place of payment for Medicare. I mentioned this earlier. If you go into a doctor's office at a hospital or you go into a doctor's office in a private building,